Welcome to the deep dive. If you're looking to, really get a handle on big topics quickly without drowning in detail, you're in the right place.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we are diving straight into Islam and its core text, the Quran.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because think about it. Almost a quarter of the world's population identifies as a Muslim.
Right, huge. Yet, for so many people, even really informed ones, the Quran itself is still, well, a bit of a closed book.
Exactly. As the scholar Garry Wills mentioned, even after events like 9/11 really put Islam in the spotlight, a lot of people, even academics, realized they hadn't actually read it. So our goal here really is to cut through some of that noise, maybe some misconceptions, and give a clearer picture of what the text actually discusses.
Precisely. And this whole idea, this deep dive, it was really sparked by looking back at some of those discussions around 9/11, that Islam hates us kind of sentiment that emerged.
Right, which was quite prevalent in some circles.
It was. And it made us think, okay, what are the actual core beliefs shaping the lives of billions? So the mission today, uncover the key ideas, the historical background of the Quran.
And see how understanding these might challenge some of those common, often quite negative assumptions.
Yeah, exactly. How it might shift perspectives.
And we're using Garry Wills' work as a guide, particularly his insights from a discussion at the Chicago Humanities Festival.
Yeah.
He really dug into the Quran, looking at the text, the history. It gives us a solid place to start.
Okay, perfect. So let's unpack some of those initial thoughts. You mentioned that Islam hates us idea, powerful phrase. But what did the data actually show?
Well, it's a stark contrast, really. Wills brings up this big worldwide Gallup poll done after 9/11.
Okay.
And it found only a tiny fraction, like 7% of Muslims worldwide actually agreed with the attackers.
Only 7%.
Yeah,
Wow.
tiny. But here's the really interesting part. 23%, almost a quarter, actively disagreed with the attacks. And crucially, they used religious reasons, Quranic justifications, to explain why terrorism is wrong according to their faith.
So they were using the Quran itself to condemn it.
Precisely. A significant number turned to their own holy text to argue against that kind of violence.
That completely flips the common narrative, doesn't it?
It really does. And it highlights something else the scholar Patricia Crone observed. Often, individuals who carry out terrorist acts, well, they don't actually know their own religion very well.
They're ignorant of the text.
Often deeply ignorant, yes. Their actions aren't necessarily flowing from a real, informed understanding of Islamic scripture.
Okay, so that's a critical point about misinterpretation or ignorance. What then is the core message? What does the Quran actually say at its heart?
Well, the core creed presented in the Quran is surprisingly inclusive. There's a passage that says something like, we believe in God and what was sent to us and what was sent down to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, the tribes, and what was given to Moses and Jesus and all the prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them, and we devote ourselves to him, meaning God.
So it's explicitly listing prophets from Jewish and Christian traditions.
Exactly. It's laying groundwork for, you could say, interfaith understanding right there. It positions Islam not as something totally new, but as the latest part of a shared story of monotheism.
That's a much, much broader perspective than I think many people associate with it.
It is. I mean, think about how different traditions might define their chosen people. Some Jewish views might emphasize circumcision, right? Some Christian views, baptism. The Quran takes a different angle. It suggests God's chosen people are actually all monotheists right from the very beginning. Adam, after he repented, is considered the first prophet.
So it's seen as this continuous line all the way back.
A continuous thread, yeah. And the Quran stresses that God sent messengers all through history, speaking to people in their own language. Hebrew for the Jewish covenant, Greek for the Christian one, Arabic for the Islamic covenant. It's presented as this universal message, just delivered in different forms for different communities. It's quite unifying, actually.
So this idea of covenant is key then, this bond with God.
Yes, a sacred agreement, a bond. Different languages, different messengers, but the same fundamental covenant with the one God.
Okay, so building on that shared foundation, does the Quran talk about the relationships between these prophets? Is there like a hierarchy or something?
There's definitely a sense of succession of shared purpose. Wills talks about the great trades between prophets, suggesting, parallels in their roles and messages.
Like Moses and Muhammad.
Exactly. Their stories have significant parallels highlighted in the Quran. But interestingly, Jesus actually gets a very high status, maybe even greater accreditation than some other prophets.
Really? Jesus?
Yes. And his mother, Mary, She's the only woman actually named in the entire Quran.
I'm kidding.
Yeah. Described as sinless, conceived Jesus through a virgin birth. She's held in incredibly high regard.
Why do you think Jesus gets such prominence? What's the thinking there?
Well, it strongly reinforces that idea of a continuous divine message, doesn't it? By elevating Jesus, it's not dismissing earlier prophets. It's affirming the same God working through different messengers. It really underlines how interconnected these faiths are supposed to be from the Islamic perspective.
Okay. So this inclusive vision is clearly central, but we also have to address, like many ancient texts, the Quran contains things that look challenging from a modern viewpoint.
Absolutely. And Wills confronts these directly, things like slavery, the status of women, what some might see as militarism.
Right.
But the crucial thing, he stresses, is context. We have to remember this is the 7th century. Similar norms, similar issues existed in Jewish and Christian societies at the time, too.
Okay, so let's take slavery first. What's the Quranic take on it?
Well, it acknowledges slavery existed. It was part of that world.
Yeah.
But it introduces a really strong moral push against it.
How so?
Freeing slaves is presented as something highly virtuous, an act that pleases Allah. It's even set as a penance for certain sins.
Okay, so it's encouraged.
Strongly encouraged. It elevates freeing slaves, manumission, to a more explicitly virtuous act than you might typically find emphasized in, say, the Old or New Testaments of the time.
That's a significant nuance. Okay, what about the status of women? That's often brought up.
Yeah, and viewed by modern standards, sure, the Quran reflects the patriarchal norms of 7th century Arabia, just like the Bible reflects its times.
But there are nuances.
Definitely. Take polygyny, having multiple wives. The Quran permits it, yes, but with really strict conditions.
Like what?
Each wife has to consent. The husband must be able to support and treat them all absolutely equally and justly, which arguably is very difficult.
Practically impossible, some might say.
Maybe. And the general limit was 4 wives. There was an exception from Muhammad himself, but Wills explains that was largely about providing support for the widows of companions killed in battle. It wasn't just accumulation.
And the dowry system that was different, too.
Very different from some later Western ideas. In the Quran, the dowry, the mahr, is a mandatory gift from the groom directly to the bride.
To her, not her family.
To her personally. And she retains full ownership and control of it, even if they divorce.
Okay. That would give women a degree of financial security.
Exactly. Quite progressive for that time and place. It gave them leverage and independence they wouldn't otherwise have had.
But what about the legal side? That idea of a woman's testimony or inheritance share being half a man's.
That's true in specific contexts mentioned in the Quran. For witnessing certain financial contracts, for instance, it might suggest 2 men, or 1 man and 2 women.
Okay.
And in inheritance, yes, sons generally inherit twice the share of daughters, but, and this is Will's point, the fact that women inherited at all and controlled their own property and dowry.
Just still a step forward.
It was significant protection and agency in an era where many women had essentially no property rights. And think about it, if a man divorced his wife, she kept her dowry. That likely made divorce a more serious economic consideration for him, too.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, provides important context. Now let's tackle militarism, and specifically that word jihad. It's so often translated as holy war.
Yeah, and that translation is just, well, it's largely inaccurate based on the Quranic usage.
So what does it mean?
Primarily, it means struggle or striving or zeal, exerting effort. The Quran talks about jihad for the Quran, which means striving to spread its message, to live according to its teachings.
So like an internal struggle too.
Absolutely. Striving for self-control, self-improvement, that's considered a major form of jihad. Warfare is only one potential and highly restricted application.
Restricted how?
The Quran is very clear that warfare is only permissible in self-defense. Aggression is forbidden. Terrorism, attacking non-combatants, is completely outside Quranic justification.
Okay. So where does this holy war idea come from then? And what about the sword verse people mention?
Well, holy war as a concept isn't really explicit in the Quran itself. The verse people call the sword verse, which, by the way, doesn't actually contain the word sword, needs its context.
Which was?
It relates to a specific historical moment in Mecca. The early Muslim community had been attacked by polytheists, idolaters. A truce was called for 4 months.
Right.
The verse basically says, if after that truce expires, those specific aggressors resume their attacks, then the Muslims are permitted to fight back.
But only against the attacker.
Yes, explicitly only against those who broke the truce and attacked them. Not civilians, not people of other faiths who weren't involved.
And it specified the idolaters who attacked.
Yes, the polytheists in Mecca who had broken the treaty. Importantly, the Quran consistently recognizes Jews and Christians as people of the book, people who also have covenants with the same God.
So it draws that distinction clearly.
Very clearly. The idea is one God revealing his will through different prophets and covenants. Yahweh in Hebrew, God the Father; Abba for Jesus in Aramaic Greek context; Allah in Arabic. Same God, different languages, different communities.
That really loops back to the inclusivity you mentioned at the start.
It does. It's a core theme.
And you mentioned prophecy earlier. In Islam, is it about predicting the future?
Not primarily, no. Prophecy in the Quranic sense is more about conveying God's message, the timeless truths about existence, and our relationship with the divine.
Okay.
Wills points out that the Quran even sees creation itself as a form of ongoing prophecy. Everything God made bears witness to him. Natural cycles, like plants reviving, are seen as signs, prophecies of the resurrection.
That's a beautiful idea. So how does Muhammad being the seal of the prophets fit in if communication is ongoing?
Seal here means confirmation, authentication, like putting a seal on a document to verify it.
Not like sealing it shut.
Exactly. It signifies Muhammad confirms the messages of the prophets before him and is part of that same authentic tradition. It doesn't mean God stopped communicating or that previous covenants, like those with Jews and Christians, are suddenly canceled. The Quran itself says they remain valid.
Got it. Now, I understand the Quran wasn't put together in the order it was revealed. Does that affect how we read it?
Oh, absolutely. It makes understanding the historical context much more challenging, but also more essential.
How so?
Well, the parts revealed early on in Mecca, when the Muslims were a small, often persecuted group, tend to focus more on theology, core beliefs, patience.
Okay.
The parts revealed later in Medina, after they migrated and formed a community facing conflict and needing governance. Well, those parts contain more specific instructions on things like law, social structure, and, yes, rules for just warfare in response to being attacked.
So the situation changed.
Right. But because the Quran was compiled after Muhammad's death, generally arranged by chapter length, not chronologically.
You lose that timeline unless you study it.
Exactly. You need to know when a verse was revealed, it sits in Laban, its life situation, to fully grasp why it was said and what it meant to that original community. It's a bit like reading the New Testament letters without knowing which church Paul was writing to and what problems they were facing. Context is key.
So Islam, like Christianity, went through stages: persecuted minority, then community building, eventually associated with empires.
Precisely. And the imperial phase of Islam, the caliphates, had its own issues and complexities, just as the imperial phase of Christianity did.
Right.
Though it is worth noting, as Wills does, that the early Islamic caliphates were often significantly more tolerant towards Jews and Christians than contemporary Christian empires were.
How so?
They were generally allowed to practice their faiths, maintain their communities, in exchange for a specific tax, the jizya, which basically funded their protection by the state. It wasn't forced conversion.
Interesting. Okay, and what about Sharia law? That term gets thrown around a lot, often negatively.
Yeah, it does. And the word Sharia itself only appears once in the Quran.
Only once?
Yes. And it doesn't mean a legal code there. It means path, like the path to an oasis, the source of life.
Metaphorical.
Very metaphorical. Over centuries, different schools of thought developed: Sunni schools, Shia schools, interpreting Islamic principles into legal frameworks. Sharia isn't one single monolithic thing.
So it's a diverse interpretations.
Hugely diverse. And the modern political idea of Sharia law somehow replacing national legal systems is, well, it's mostly a misunderstanding or a political distortion. In many Muslim-majority countries and for Muslim communities elsewhere, Sharia principles often inform personal status laws, marriage, divorce, inheritance, things that operate alongside national law, much like religious courts or rules in other communities.
Okay, that clarifies things. And just to place Islam chronologically.
Sure. So Jewish revelations, pre-Jesus, Jesus 1st century CE, Muhammad early 7th century CE.
Right.
But from the Quran's perspective, God, Allah, is eternal. Muhammad's revelations aren't seen as starting a new religion, but as continuing and confirming that single ancient divine message, specifically for Arabic speakers this time.
A continuation. Got it. There was also an interesting point Wills made about Islam and nature.
Yes, this idea of conversing with the cosmos. The Quran has this strong theme of communication being fundamental to all creation. Everything glorifies God in its own way. And this really resonates today, doesn't it, with environmental concerns. It suggests a kind of divine mandate for stewardship, for caring for God's creation, not destroying it.
That's powerful. Okay, one more big area, religion and state. The idea of theocratic Islamic states.
Right. And the key point here, much like with Christianity, is that the idea of a theocratic state developed after the time of the founding prophets.
Neither Jesus nor Muhammad set up a detailed government blueprint.
Pretty much. Jesus famously said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Muhammad led a community in Medina, yes, but the structures evolved organically, often in response to immediate needs. He didn't lay out a fixed constitution for all time.
So the later theocracies weren't necessarily following the original model.
They were later developments, interpretations, often politically motivated. I mean, think about Christianity. The Catholic Church fought the separation of church and state for centuries. And Wills emphasizes there's actually a broad consensus among mainstream Muslim scholars today that many regimes calling themselves Islamic states and pushing a specific political agenda, while they lack a genuine basis in the Quran itself.
This all really brings us back to the importance of actually reading the source, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Wills shares that personal story, feeling almost ashamed that he, an historian, hadn't read the Quran properly until after 9/11.
Yeah.
His book title, What the Quran Meant, really stresses the need to understand the original meaning, the context. And he made a point of relying on contemporary respected Islamic scholarship, like the study Koran, which has been praised by Islamic theologians themselves.
So engaging with the tradition respectfully.
Exactly, not just imposing an outside view.
Okay, and one final theological question. The problem of evil. How does the Quran approach that?
You know, it's quite similar in principle to Jewish and Christian traditions. Evil is generally attributed to human weakness, our fallibility, our free will.
So, human choice.
Yes. Humans aren't gods. We have limits. We make mistakes. We can choose harmful paths. The Quran uses some pretty vivid metaphors, like your own skin testifying against you on Judgment Day, to emphasize accountability for those choices. But the fundamental source of evil is seen as residing in that imperfect human agency, much like in the other Abrahamic faiths.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together. This deep dive, really guided by Garry Wills' perspective, it shows a Quran with a core message that's far more inclusive than often portrayed.
Recognizing that shared line of prophets, one God, different covenants.
Right, and it gives us a much more nuanced view on those challenging topics. Slavery, women's status, seeing them in their 7th century context, but also seeing the ethical pushes within the text.
Like encouraging freeing slaves or giving women property rights through the dowry.
Exactly. And understanding jihad not just as war, but fundamentally as struggle, striving, with warfare as a strictly defensive measure.
And recognizing the importance of historical context, the Meccan versus Medinan revelations, and how later interpretations like Sharia or the idea of an Islamic state evolved over time.
It really underscores the need to get past generalizations and engage directly with the text.
Absolutely. Looking at primary sources like the Quran, understanding their context, it's just crucial for challenging those simplistic, often negative stereotypes we see all around us, especially in our interconnected world.
It really is. So hopefully for our listeners, this has sparked some curiosity, maybe challenged an assumption or two.
We hope so.
We'd encourage everyone listening to maybe explore the Quran or resources like the study Quran that Wills mentions with this more informed perspective.
Yeah.
And maybe just think about this. How can genuinely engaging with the foundational texts of different religions, understanding their complexities and contexts, actually help us foster better dialogue and maybe push back against those easy generalizations we all encounter? Something to mull over.